Okay, welcome everyone to a very special Plena Wealth Advisors podcast.
Again, this week joining me, we've got Craig White up in our Kelowna office and Clark Linton around the corner here in Vancouver.
As we continue to endeavor to bring timely and relevant information, we're very pleased to have a special guest with us today. We've got Ed Mills, our Washington policy analyst from Raymond James. Ed's been featured extensively in media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and CNBC. Prior to joining Raymond James, Ed spent more than 7 years as head of Washington Policy Group at FBR & Co. and nearly a decade on Capitol Hill on various financial-focused committees and programs. Ed, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Great to be here with you guys.
Very timely, as we just had the debt ceiling agreement go through the Senate, I guess, early last week, and lots to talk about in regards to that and various other political matters. But first and foremost, what can we take away from this debt agreement?
So we didn't default. That's a good thing. I guess we can still have full faith and credit in the United States government. The two things that I probably focus on now is what was in the deal, and then obviously number two, what's the market impact? So in terms of what was in the deal, I break it down into this. It was spending caps, defense spending got a boost, domestic spending is capped at last year's levels. That's actually better than I think the market was looking for here. Number two, taking back unspent COVID money, that was about $30 billion. Number three, some new work requirements if you have public assistance. Number four, restarting student loan programs, and some other cats and dog type of things in there. But generally speaking, one of the ways in which I would view this is that back in 2011, the market low wasn't when we got a deal. The market low was after the deal. We struck a deal in July of 2011. Market low that year was in October. Because after the deal, Congress still has to decide how much money they are going to spend. Back in 2011, there were much bigger cuts that went into effect on October 1st than the market has expected. I don't think that's going to happen this time because we have a much shallower cut, or actually some increases in the budget versus 2011. But if there's one thing I get a lot of questions on right now is liquidity. The U.S. Treasury is going to issue about $1 trillion of U.S. debt over the next month or two. That's 4 to 5 times the normal amount. So the source of funds for that and the market impact, I think, is probably one of the bigger debated things at this point, Jay.
Yeah, Ed, you mentioned, post-agreement was reached that there was a quote-unquote market low. When you refer to that, are you talking about these rating agencies that essentially re-rated U.S. credit after the agreement was reached, and it was a downgrade that we saw that created more volatility again after the agreement reached? Is that what you're talking about, the market low?
Yeah, well, it's a combination of things, but Craig, it's really important to bring that up because back in 2011, S&P Global did downgrade the United States debt from AAA to AA. And this time around, Fitch has put the United States on credit watch negative. So part of the market reaction was after the deal, that downgrade occurred, and that had never happened before. And a lot of inflow of conversations were like, what does this mean? At the end of the day, it actually didn't really mean anything. Fitch is put the United States on credit watch negative. My base case is that they downgrade the US because of that. They argue that the political process is broken. There's a chance of a future default. Under this deal, they did extend out the debt limit to January of 2025. So if we want to pencil in for about June of 2025 for us to do the next podcast on did the United States default, like we're going to go through this again. We hit the debt limit in January. We just do extraordinary measures into May, June time period. So we're going to do that again. But in 2011, part of the market reaction was a real question on a lot of the holders of the US Treasury debt. Can they own something that's not AAA rated? Since 2011, a lot of those holders have updated their policy statements to understand that it is government guaranteed debt or AAA rated. So as long as the government guarantee remains, it's going to be fine. And I think there was this idea that we shouldn't necessarily let the individuals at one of these credit rating agencies determine whether or not we should own U.S. treasuries or not. We can come up with that own decision ourselves. On a lot of other debt, you would require some ratings from a credit rating agencies, but it is a little bit of a different conversation when we're talking about the U.S. government.
Some of the concerns and observations of the credit rating agencies, I think, are quite relevant. When you look at $1 trillion of new debt issuance added to existing debt, when we went through this debt ceiling, and we've gone through it in the past, one of the main questions we get asked by clients, recognizing that, hey, we're going to get through this time, is, are we just kicking the can down the road? And at what point does this really come home to roost? Like, at what point does this really have to be tackled? And you look at the budget, you look at entitlements like Social Security, Medicaid, et cetera. I think those are politically tough things to touch, but at what point do you have to start looking at those things, because debt really becomes a serious issue that you can't kick down the road anymore?
Yeah, Clark, you're absolutely right. I think what we would highlight is that when we look at the budget agreement that came together, they said you couldn't even talk about entitlements. That's about 60% of budget. It's growing. It had been closer to 12%, now up to about 17% of the US budget is debt service burden. So what the Fed does matters in terms of how much the United States government pays, but it's that final, it had been about 30% of the United States government that is in the discretionary spending. You take half of that away, you say we can't talk about defense. And so we're talking about something in that 10 to 15% and thinking we're going to solve the problem larger. Kind of with just this small, very kind of, tiny fraction of the budget, you'd have to go to zero and you still wouldn't solve the problems. And obviously the United States government is going to spend more than zero on healthcare, on education, on a whole host of nutrition programs. But what I have always observed in DC is that DC does not act until there's a crisis or a deadline. And anytime I'm looking to see if we're going to see something, I'm like, all right, what's the crisis? What's the deadline? There could be a growing crisis on entitlements, but there's no deadline yet. For a lot of individuals, entitlements, Social Security, Medicare especially, every time I get a paycheck, I look, I can see the money coming out. And so why would you balance the budget off of the money that I'm paying in every single one of my paychecks? So entitlement reform is taking something away from people that they have paid for and that they have been promised. You only would get entitlement reform if people are afraid that what they paid for and what they promised was going to be taken away from them because it was no longer solvent. So until we get to that point, I honestly don't think entitlement reform is on the table. And I think there's a lot of conversation to have that if you really want to tackle some of the big questions or kind of big dollar amounts, taxes and other types of spending should also be part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's something we talk about if we get into presidential the 2024 election on what's the outlook for taxes. But kind of going back to debt and $31 trillion that the US economy has assumed now. That's another topical question that we continuously hear from clients is, what's happening with inflation and what's happening with monetary policy. And I think we're right in a blackout period right now with the Federal Reserve, or this week, with an expectation, or we get an announcement next week on policy going forward. I think the Bank of Canada's not too far behind that. And you've almost kind of seen a bit of a pivot here on what central bank policy is. There's a possibility now that we see another round or another 25 basis point increase. What's kind of the chatter amongst DC these days on policy?
Yeah, Craig, I'm so happy you used the word pivot because I want to go back to the original pivot. And this is really going to inform how I think about monetary policy. Now, when we're talking about monetary policy, you turn on CNBC, you read the Journal, you turn on BNN, kind of up in Canada. You are looking at kind of all these different economic metrics, and we're kind of contorting them. We're now into like super core X this, X that. I don't think enough attention is brought to the political component. So that's why I wanted to talk about this pivot. So back in 2021, Jay Powell was seeking a second term as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And what was he saying at that point? Inflation is transitory. We're not even thinking about tightening. And then Joe Biden made his pick. He gave him a second term. 4 days later, he's in front of the Senate Banking Committee. And all of a sudden, Jay Powell's Paul Volcker and saying like inflation is way too high and that we are going to raise until we get this under control. The only thing that changed between kind of not thinking about to being Paul Volcker was that he got his power. Now, the Fed is under a real big threat right now, and I think it's probably their biggest threat to their power since at least the financial crisis, and they can't really afford to make more mistakes, or politically, they can have some of their power taken away from them. They only exist because Congress and the president allow them to exist. And so what are some of the mistakes they could make? Mistake number one is stopping raising rates and then looking foolish because they have to raise rates again. And so the messaging that we have gotten out of this next meeting is I think they want to pause, but they want to keep that optionality open. So they've gone to their Fed whisperers through the Wall Street Journal, Nick Timiraos, and said, we might pause here, but we keep this option open. And I've also been of the belief that the Fed, because of a concern that once they pause, they can't restart, was going to do as many rate increases as possible. Get that dry powder because they know the economic impact of cutting rates. They don't necessarily know the economic impact of increasing rates. Now, the second mistake I think that they could make is if they cut too soon. And the reason for this, and Craig, you might know this, but when we calculate inflation, do you know what percentage of housing costs we put into our inflation metrics? What weighting we give that?
I got to think it's probably somewhere 30, 40, 50%.
Yeah, right in the middle there, 40%.
Yeah.
So in the United States, housing is, mostly done through the federal government, again, through getting loans that are 30-year fixed rate mortgages through government-backed enterprises. And, during the middle of COVID, I locked in a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 2.875%. That was kind of money that we're probably not going to see again. But 80% of US households that have a mortgage have a mortgage less than 4%. So they're not incentivized to move. For those who don't have a mortgage, they're looking at a 7% mortgage if they were to get one today. If the Fed cuts and mortgage rates go back to 5%, below 5%, that's going to unlock a lot of activity in the housing market. And I think it's probably going to drive up home price appreciation in the United States. And if you get massive home price appreciation, what you'll be seeing is a second wave of inflation in the United States before the next election. That would be catastrophic for the Fed. So from my perspective, they cut in November, they'd have a full year of all that new housing inflation. You can't do that. Maybe you can cut in April or May of next year if it's absolutely necessary, and you only get a couple months, and you probably don't see that second wave truly show up until after the election next year, and that would be mission accomplished. But look at the political incentives of the Fed when you're trying to determine their direction of monetary policy, because they're equally as important in my mind as some of those economic indicators.
I think that's a really interesting observation. So you think, other than the market maybe being incorrect about a cut, late this year, that most of the Fed's moves are already priced into the market?
Well, the bond market is pricing in a cut, and I think they're wrong. And one of the things, and Clark, I'll ask you this question because I like putting people on the spot. When was the last time one of the members of the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve voted against a monetary policy decision?
10 years ago, maybe?
Longer. It was actually back almost 20 years ago, 2005. Hurricane Katrina had hit the Gulf Coast of the United States, and there was one governor who said, Chairman Greenspan, I'm not comfortable with doing this 25 basis point increase. Never heard from that guy again. Governor Olson, right? A household name. And so when I look at the Fed and what Jay Powell wants to do, can he be Volcker if he wants to be? I was looking at who Joe Biden was appointing to the Federal Reserve, and one person in particular that I was following is Dr. Lisa Cook. She's a former economics professor out of Michigan State, very liberal, party line vote. If there was someone that might kind of push that kind of first vote against the chairman in almost 20 years, and think about what we went through in this last 20 years with monetary policy. It's, some of the most out of the box thinking, some of the most extraordinary monetary policy in the history of the world, and everyone's fully on board. That's either extraordinary or kind of incredibly dysfunctional. I have not yet figured that out. But Dr. Lisa Cook, I say, like, would she let these interest rates go as high as they're going, or would start pushing back, say, hey, we're concerned about the cost for someone to buy a home, the cost of credit in the economy? What happens when unemployment rates start ticking up? Is she going to be comfortable holding steady and letting millions of Americans potentially get laid off from their job? And so I thought that could be a real challenge until I read her first speech. And her first speech as a governor at the Fed said, the economic models of the Fed are broken. I mean, just think about that for a second. All this trust we have in the Fed, and one of the governors are like, we're not quite sure what's happening here. And she, and she also said, we have to wait until we raise the rates to where we're going, hitting that terminal rate is what they call it, and then wait to make sure that the economic data that comes in matches the new models that we have developed. So when we do see that uptick in unemployment rate, which started this last month, I think there's a whole host of reasons, but if it gets up to 5%, and she is putting a lot of pressure on Jay Powell to cut, they're like, hey, you were the voice as to why we had to wait. You were the voice that the models were broken. We have to follow your own advice. And so to me, that is once again showing how the politics or the culture of the board have set up this trajectory as much as any economic indicator that's out there.
Interest rates and inflation have been, much of the talk of the market and the focus of the market over the last 12 to 18 months. Over the last couple of months, it's been the debt ceiling. I think, my own view is the market has spent less focus on more geopolitical events that may affect the market. We look at Russia, Ukraine with a potential counteroffensive this spring by the Ukraine, deepening ties between the US and Taiwan, China issues in general. Just curious in your view on some of these geopolitical things, are there other things that the market has not been focusing on that you think it will in the next number of months?
Yeah, so a lot of these things end up being somewhat binary. I do think that if we got a better than expected resolution in any of the issues you discussed, that's a further upside to this market, especially where, in the S&P 500, so much of the gains have been in that top 10 group of stocks. If we can get a sense that the global economy could do better because some of this geopolitical risk is coming down, the rest of the market, I think, would re-rate. And I think this is a potential opportunity. But in terms of what you're highlighting there, as it relates to the war between Russia and Ukraine, we're at an inflection point in my perspective. Ukraine, if they are successful in this counteroffensive, that's going to put an incredible amount of pressure on Putin to go to the negotiating table. And probably where that pressure comes from, surprising to most, would be coming from China. There was a lot of attention recently when Putin and Xi met, and whether or not that Xi was going to get involved in the war in Ukraine and support Russia. But when I talked to our experts, what I heard was Xi does not want to get involved. The one goal of Xi, the president, the general secretary of China, is to make sure Putin stays in power. Because if Putin's not in power, there could be a failed state on the China-Russia border. if Putin is not in power, China is not guaranteed to get the commodities that they depend upon to grow their economy. And so if this counteroffensive by Ukraine is effective, and it looks as if Putin could lose, the one person that can go to Putin and say, I will do what it takes to keep you in power, but you have to withdraw from Ukraine, would be China. And that's, in my mind, one of the reasons, and we should talk about some of the other reasons, the United States is trying to not escalate things too much this year with China, and looking at them as a potential partner where they've been more of an adversary in the last couple of years.
So a huge market negative would be, and this is some of the talk a few months ago, whether China would supply Russia with arms or other supplies. By the sounds of your comments, that's maybe not off the table, but low probability at this point.
Yeah, I put much more probability of she is self-interested in this conversation. She really only wants to make sure he gets access to the commodities and resources that Russia provides in a very inexpensive way. And she is self-interested in making sure, when Putin and she get together, it's kind of a peer group of two people. There's not a lot of other autocrats with large countries that you can invite to that. They are honest friends. And that preservation of Putin is also his self-preservation.
Yeah. So coming back to the Canadian political sphere where we all live, is what do you make of this kind of repositioning, we're seeing with China and the US and Taiwan and Russia, and there's kind of these, the friends and foes or lines are being redrawn, and, we're now analyzing supply chains with COVID, shining a light on where we get our PP&E from and all these other sorts of issues that sprung up when COVID had its effect. Obviously Canada here, we're big suppliers of everything, commodities, critical minerals have been a big kind of topic that we've seen recently. What do you see politically on your side that could either, help or hurt Canada, and where does Canada stand to gain in the near future?
Yeah, Jay, there's like 5 different things I want to go off with that question. So, let's start with, some of those supply chain issues you talked about. And that comes in what I would say is, I fundamentally believe that the United States and arguably North America, so to absolutely include Canada in this conversation, is at the beginning of an industrial renaissance. And what's different this time is that when we've had politicians talk about rebuilding the industrial base of the United States or North America, it usually was led through a jobs lens. Now it's through a national security lens. We have had a lot of tech restrictions on China over the last couple of years, and that's because we view different technology as a national security asset. Arguably, we should have viewed that much earlier. And with that, they saw Taiwan Semi, which is the global supplier of really all of the leading edge semiconductors, being so geographically vulnerable, and said, well, why are we no longer producing these semiconductors in the United States? So Congress approved hundreds of billions of dollars to restart the production of semiconductors in the United States, especially at the leading edge. Now, after that bill passed in a bipartisan manner, where we see the conversation going is energy permitting reform, a key part of the debt limit deal that we really didn't talk about, but it's only the beginning of energy permitting reform that's necessary. So last year, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. In that, they had almost $400 billion worth of tax credits for clean energy. With energy permitting reform, that could easily be $1 trillion. And let's think about one of the provisions of this. And this is a good example of where national security comes into effect. So a couple of years ago, I was talking to a former Defense Department official, and he said, for the last generation plus, the United States has fought wars in the Middle East to protect access to oil, natural gas. It's an unfortunate fact, but it's true. As the United States moves towards the electrification of their vehicles and requiring EVs and EV batteries, The United States can't shift that geopolitical vulnerability from the Middle East to China, where much of that EV battery and EV car making is done. And so when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there are huge tax credits in there for any battery that is recycled, not in the United States, but anywhere in North America. We recognize that supply chains, especially in the automobile industry, really are kind of a full North America story, and Canada and the United States are interlinked in that. But that wasn't a like, oh, we like EVs. That was, we don't want to have a war with China. Some of the other critical parts, as you mentioned, critical minerals. The United States has identified 50 critical minerals. About half of them, we are dependent more than 50% outside the United States. When I go and I talk to investors in Canada and I have my list of critical minerals, they like to go through the list and they're like, yep, we got that. We have that. Yep, we could supply that. And so to the extent that these critical minerals are such an important thing to the national security of the United States, to Canada, to NATO generally, that is going, in my mind, going to be the next CHIPS Act. That's going to be the next thing that the United States really invests in, making sure that there's enough money to go after the critical minerals that are available to us with friendly allies rather than some potential hostile enemies.
Yeah, that friendly allies, I think resonates with us, because I think this all kind of speaks to the fragility of the nations who do house a lot of those critical minerals, and where that supply is going to come from as we transition to, as this green transition, there's a big focus on developed economies. So do you expect kind of more trade negotiations between, developed economies, Western economies, and places like the Eurozone, et cetera?
Yeah, so Craig, the things in the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the things about laws in the United States, you have to pass the bill before you do all the regulations. And in the regulation is sometimes where some of the critical decisions are being made. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, big focus in the last couple of years because he was the key to getting this done. He's upset about the way in which the Biden administration is pursuing a lot of the provisions of that bill, because what they're saying is not only is it companies in the United States, but if you have a free trade agreement with the United States, you're automatically included in getting some of these tax subsidies. And we're seeing kind of a real attention globally. A trade agreement was just signed with Taiwan, something that upsets China. We're updating trade agreements with the UK after Brexit. We're looking at trade agreements throughout the Eurozone. Really have to look at more trade agreements in South America where some of these critical minerals are. And that's part of the reason why when I look at that estimate of almost $392 billion of tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, and thinking it could be multiples of that and a real tailwind to clean energy technology and equities, it's because in any opportunity this Biden administration has, they're expanding definitions rather than restricting definitions, because it is partnering, and it's not an end of globalization, but it is a desire to make sure supply chains are closer and with allies.
Up here in Canada, Ed, we're one of the, as you probably know, one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. And I'm curious, as far as, necessary resources, is there an appetite in Washington to look at nuclear as a, new or a stronger energy source than it is today?
Absolutely. I think that one of the growing movements in Congress is to restrict uranium out of Russia. And so you'll need alternative sources. Clearly, Canada would be a key partner there, as well as there has been a push against nuclear for years in the United States, almost exclusively driven by environmentalists. And the conversation has changed where a lot of environmentalists are now pushing back and saying you can't have an honest conversation about the decarbonization of energy sources without considering nuclear energy. And that's very much a part of the future. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, again, there were some incentives there, but uranium is on that list of critical minerals that is going to grow in importance. And if you can, from a policy perspective, get to choose who you're getting your uranium from, Russia or Canada, I think that's a no-brainer.
Respecting your time, Ed, which is extremely valuable. All this kind of speaks to, probably the political talking points that we're going to hear here over the next couple of years. And again, going back to what we hear from clients is this political divide, whether it's the debt ceiling, what should we expect, or what should we be looking at for the 2024 election south of the border here? You've seen a few candidates throw their hats in the proverbial ring over the past number of weeks. What's the inside scoop on what we can expect over the next 18 months?
It's gonna be crazy. It's gonna be interesting. It's
understatement.
Well, as I think about this, there are so many different variables. And so trying to not get too deep in the weeds on the variables, I start out with the base assumption that Joe Biden has said that he's running for re-election. He should be the nominee for the Democrats. There are a number of Republicans who are running, but the person who's leading in the polls, and it has a significant lead, is Donald Trump. And so the most likely outcome as we sit here today is a rematch of the 2020 election. Now, is that guaranteed to happen? Absolutely not. Could there be a third-party candidate? Could other people emerge as credible challengers to former President Trump? Could Biden decide that he's not going to run for a re-election? All of that's on the table. In terms of market impacts of this election, one of the things that people really need to watch is tax policy, because the tax changes that went into place back in 2017 under former President Trump, all of the individual tax provisions expire in 2025. The corporate provisions were permanent. So if it is a Republican sweep, expect that to be extended out. And there'll be a debate whether or not that's a market positive. That does cost $3.5 trillion to extend that out for 10 years. So that's a lot of money. If Democrats win the presidency and/or one of the houses of Congress, they want to rework some of those individual taxes, especially as the Trump tax cuts disproportionately benefited states that were run by Republicans, and high-cost tax states saw their taxes go up for many individuals. But one of the things that I'd highlight on the individual side is the estate tax also changes significantly in 2025. So if you are a high net worth individual in the United States, now is the time to talk to your financial advisor about estate tax planning before these changes take effect, because it might be too late to make some of those changes after the election and after the deadlines in 2025.
Interesting.
If you were to, if it isn't Trump and Biden coming into 2024, who are the most likely candidates in your opinion on each side?
If it's not Biden, I think the most next probable person is the vice president, Kamala Harris, but that's not a sure deal either. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, absolutely would be on the list, and then Bernie Sanders runs again, Elizabeth Warren runs again. If there is a primary on the Democratic side, talking to our healthcare policy analyst, he would warn you any healthcare stocks probably come under pressure. We saw a lot of that during the 2016 election, in the 2020 primary, due to the uncertainty to kind of Medicare for all conversations for the prescription drug negotiations. On the Republican side, what I would be focused on versus some of the names is, can you get a candidate that keeps the Trump base, but has voters who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 willing to either return home to the Republican Party or switch their allegiance, especially among independents? I'm not sure if Governor DeSantis of Florida would do that. It seems kind of too much of an overlap between Trump's base and who he is going for. Someone I'd be looking at is a governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. He's the only person who has won since the 2020 election, a statewide election where he was able to solidly hold the Trump base. And Virginia is a state that has trended very much towards the Democrats in recent years, but was able to get about 20% of the Biden vote and eke out an election victory. It's those type of calculus. Who can actually make a better case in some of those swing states that Democrats were able to win in 2020 that Republicans need to win back in 2024 if they want to have the White House?
Ed, as we started this call and we were talking about the debt ceiling, you mentioned the credit rating agencies, making a comment about how the political system is broken to some degree in their view. And from an outsider looking in from this side of the border, the last number of years kind of seen politics kind of get, more extreme on both sides. Over the long haul, how do you fix that system? Is there the potential for, somebody more centrist, like an independent coming in at some point? Up here, we have a three-party system. I know a lot of history in the United States is not going to change, but just curious on your view on that.
Well, and
Yeah,
maybe
so-
I'll add in too. My latest readings for approval ratings on both sides are some of the lowest in history. It speaks to people are looking for change or looking for leadership, or at least a smoother political landscape.
So here will be my last question. Who was the last third-party candidate to receive a single electoral college vote?
Ross Perot?
He didn't get a single
No, he didn't
electoral college vote.
You got
Even
20%
though
of the vote.
Yeah, right. Which is, I mean, I would have bet money that you were going to tell me Ross Perot, and I would have bet that you were not going to come up with John Anderson in 1980. It's kind of who. But the fact of the matter is, it's really difficult, even when you get north of 20% of the vote, to register as one electoral college vote when everything is the final tally. So is it always possible to get a third party candidate? Yes, but it's structurally kind of set up for Dems versus Republicans. How do we break kind of some of this brinkmanship and kind of this polarization? I'd argue do more of things like we did with the debt limit in the final deal, where the people voting against it were the extremes of both parties. You go back last Congress, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the largest ever infrastructure project in the history of the United States, getting approved. It was mostly kind of the middle voting for that. And then you look at the election results from 2022, and almost everyone who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill was reelected. And a lot of the people who voted against it lost their seats. And so the currency for a member of Congress, for a president, it's votes. Our currency is, does a stock go up? Are you able to make more money? It's just a very different set of incentives. So if you have a series of things where it's the middle that comes together, the extremes vote no, and those who voted yes get reelected, and those who voted no find themselves out of office, that's how you change the system. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's actually part of what Joe Biden's kind of reelection campaign is going to be. Yes, I'm old. Yes, he might be relatively low approval, but what he's trying to do is establish a series of bills that pass on a bipartisan basis. The CHIPS Act that I talked about, bipartisan. And so going back to the old incentives will change kind of future ways in which people come together. Bipartisanship used to be the thing we ran on in the United States, but bipartisanship in compromise are now dirty words in politics. The more that changes, the more we get back to a more traditional electoral system.
I think that's such a common sense response. I appreciate that.
Well,
I'm
Ed,
trying to
thanks. I think we've taken up a lot of your time, and we really appreciate you coming on and helping us understand, or at least get a glimpse into kind of what's happening in DC these days. And we hope you'll come back as the presidential election kind of heats up over this next year and a half, because I'm sure there's going to be lots to talk about. So please do come back, and again,
Will do.
thanks so
And if
much
we
for
can
your time.
kind of schedule that June 2025 debt ceiling update is now, because we're totally going to do that.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks for
hopefully
your
we
time,
don't have
Ed.
to talk about it every 2 years, but
Oh, we will.
yeah.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks,
Much
guys.
appreciated. That's great to have him on. It's, I know you let off with a bit of his history, and Ed is very highly respected, not only within Raymond James, but amongst kind of the political scene. And again, you often see him on these leading channels to get the inside scoop, what's happening. What are you guys' thoughts there?
Yeah. What takeaways for you guys?
I mean, one thing I love that it's something that I always kind of say is, when he's looking at all these geopolitical conflicts and really just saying, hey, there's a lot that's kind of scary, that's going wrong right now, and anything better than expectation is going to be what moves the markets higher, right? It's not that we need to come up with, hey, here's exactly how things are going to end in the Ukraine, or here's exactly what agreement's going to be made over Taiwan. It's just that once things start to get better, if there's any improvement, that's when the market's gonna go higher. And I think that's kind of what we need to be prepared for. Just reflecting on right now, the market is being held back by all of these various geopolitical issues. And there's always going to be some issues out there, but there's a lot that could improve, really in the short term here, which could be that catalyst, even in 2023.
Yeah, a lot of potential for surprises. Positive surprises.
Yeah.
One of the things I took away is just his comments on this new industrial renaissance. Sourcing critical minerals and materials closer to home. That's an obvious benefit to Canada. I think we'll have to see, how our government here in Canada approaches that. Hopefully, they see an opportunity there. That was one of the biggest things. I think heading into the election, I think, he's probably right. I mean, who knows who's going to be the candidates in the 2024 election. But what the market will be concerned about, will be some of the important issues that are part of those campaigns. Tax policy being number one, probably.
Yeah, and I would say on the topic of inflation and monetary policy, I know we've talked about that a lot on these podcasts. I think we could again continue to say that we're probably in the eighth or ninth inning of this interest rate tightening cycle, and if you couple that with the unemployment stats that we continue to see come in, and last Friday is a prime example. The U.S. added almost close to 350,000 jobs in the month of May. I think it speaks to the point that, there's recessionary fears that you may just end up engineering a perfect landing where you bring down inflation, yet the economy still is quite resilient. And you're seeing that with a lot of the data. If anybody who's traveling, going to restaurants, the services side of the economy is quite strong right now. So as you said, Clark, the surprise is that we don't see this big economic fallout in the face of high inflation that's coming down.
Yeah. And I think just his point about the, data always being kind of so backward looking, and he almost implied that the Fed, and the board of governors were winging it to some degree, which, as we know, all economists are, making forecasts which are incredibly difficult to get right. So, we'll see how these next few Fed meetings go, but more or less, I think we've got inflation under control, although let's not speak too soon.
Yeah.
Again, I hope everyone found that interesting, and please give us your feedback and hopefully tune in. And you'll notice we've got all these on YouTube now, so like and subscribe if you can.